Thank you, Speaker. My grievance today is to reflect on the damage that was done to my electorate and Victoria from the devastating consequences of the Kennett government. It has been 20 years since the Bracks government was elected, bringing an end to the devastation brought to Victoria by the Kennett government. When Kennett was elected in 1992, I was a paramedic working in the western suburbs of Melbourne. Through my travels across Victoria, I got to see firsthand the devastation that the cuts that the Kennett and his government subjected to towns right across the state. Country towns in particular, like Maryborough, Ararat, Stawell, were absolutely decimated by the cuts to schools, hospitals, healthcare, social services, transport and jobs. Kennett scissorhands cut and slashed right across this state and our towns, and the state are still now recovering. As a paramedic, I would visit these towns and the despair was noticeable. The shops shut, businesses closed, people couldn't sell their houses to look for new opportunities, even if they were lucky enough to find any. Whole regions still haven't recovered from that damage. It has caused generational poverty and damage that will continue on for years to come. My fellow paramedics and I, during the period, noticed longer wait times for ambulances, less staff at hospitals to cope with emergencies, and the morale in healthcare was at an all-time low. Across the state, 350 schools closed. My own primary school of Maidstone Primary was one of them. 7,000 teaching jobs were eliminated. Yeah. Some of the other schools that were closed was Alameen Primary School, Bennett Woods Primary School, Jordanville South Primary School, Heatherton Primary School, Springvale North Primary School, Doveton West Primary School, Bonnie Doon Primary School, Glenburn Primary School, Powelltown Primary School, Woods Point Primary School, Yark Primary School, all closed. And I can go on with the other 330 primary schools that were closed. I did say across the state, if you listen to the start of it, mate. Hospitals like Altona, Essendon, Mordialloc Cheltenham, St Kilda Day Hospital and Burwood closed. Others like Geelong, the Alfred, the Austin, Royal Children's, the Royal Women's, the Royal Melbourne, Ballarat, Dandenong, Wangaratta saw significant cuts to their services. Mildura and Latrobe Regional Hospital privatised. Thankfully, only now is Mildura getting their hospital back in public hands. I want to congratulate the independent member for Mildura on her advocacy on this issue. Family planning services were cut, women's health never being a priority. Also, the member for Bass reminded me that the Kennett government tried to close the Fitzroy pool and that she was in the protest and the photo of many hundreds of people standing in an empty Fitzroy pool. We lost the State Electricity Commission of Victoria. The safety of Victorians was put at risk for profit. Privatisation of the sector has led to poor maintenance of our energy infrastructure. The ability to cope with the energy needs of the state has diminished. Privatisation has had enormous effect on Victorian safety and their bank accounts. The Black Saturday bushfires that will be forever in our memories were influenced by poor maintenance in the electricity infrastructure and the lack of trained professionals and adequate workforce to maintain them. Privatisation has cost Victorians in their energy bills and has cost lives. When Kennett was elected, I was a shop steward representing paramedics. Kennett's agenda was to slash and burn the public sector, cut the numbers of public sector workers, introduce individual contracts.
I asked the member to resume his seat for a moment. On a point of order, the manager.
Just on the issue of relevance, is the member for Melton seriously saying that Black Saturday is a result of the Kennett government? Because that's what he's just said.
Manager of opposition.
A result of the Kennett government? You've got to be kidding me.
There's no point of order.
That's a ridiculous thing to say. Absolutely.
Order. There's no point of order. The members will cease shouting across the chamber so that the member can be heard. The member from Melton has a call.
Thank you, Speaker.
Order. There's another point of order. The member from Melton to resume his seat. Order. The member for Ringwood. The member for
and probably should return to his seat if he wants to interject.
The issues surrounding the terrible tragedy of Black Saturday have always enjoyed a level of bipartisanship in this place, and for the member for Melton to make the claims that he just did in this House is shameful, and I take personal offence for what he said, and I ask you to direct him to withdraw.
Well, I didn't hear the comments, but I do ask that the member for Warrandyte has taken personal offence at some comments. I ask the member to withdraw.
I'll withdraw.
Member for Melton to continue. Order. I asked the member to Melton to resume his seat. I warned the manager of opposition business to cease shouting across the chamber. I warned members who are shouting they'll be removed from the chamber without warning. The member for Melton to continue.
Thank you, Speaker. I do withdraw, but I should say if they'd listened to what I said, they would have got the full details.
Order. A further point of order, member for Warrandyte.
As you well know, Speaker, and the member should know, that there should be no surrounding commentary around a withdrawal.
Order. The member for Warrandyte resume his seat. Before the member for Melton continues, he did withdraw in an unqualified way, but it's not appropriate then to add commentary to the withdrawal. The member for Melton to continue.
Thank you, Speaker. In fact, because of Kennett's agenda, Melbourne often stood still as massive rallies gathered here outside this very building. Outside here, 100,000 workers stood up for their rights, protections and security in employment. Let me tell you some of the things that occurred at Ambulance Victoria. A new CEO was appointed to Metropolitan Ambulance Service, a gentleman by the name of Jack Furman. His intention was to come in and steamroll change within the Metropolitan Ambulance Service. He wanted to change the culture. He privatised the fleet maintenance workshops in Melbourne. This meant that 20 to 30 mechanics who specialised in the maintenance of ambulance vehicles were made redundant. It also meant the Melbourne Ambulance Workshop was closed and outsourced to private operators. This caused great concern to paramedics, believing that the vehicles that they responded in would not be maintained to the same standards that they were previously in order to do their job efficiently and safely, something of significant importance if you need to respond to a call out at speed. Over time, there were many circumstances that were raised with the ambulance service about safety of ambulances. These weren't just vehicles, these were paramedic workplaces. The union took many vehicle disputes to the Fair Work Commission for resolution. Kennett also privatised the Ambulance Communications Centre to Intergraph. I'm sure you'll remember it. But I'll come back to Intergraph a little bit later. He privatised the non-emergency patient transport and also a lot of the standby at public events like the AFL football, the horse races, the harness racing. He tried to portray that these events were staffed by paramedics, but of course they were not. Of course, some of the private transport companies were owner-operated by ambulance managers. This issue was later dealt with through the Ambulance Royal Commission. One thing that I thank Jeff Kennett for is that I decided to move from being a paramedic to become the Assistant Secretary and then later Secretary of the Ambulance Union. Let me return to talking about the privatisation of ambulance communication to Intergraph. For the first time in this country, ambulance communication was conducted by this American company called Intergraph. It was also the first time that they employed their own communication staff directly. They did not use paramedics as call takers or dispatchers. The ambulance service had to provide paramedic staff called duty team managers to oversee ambulance resourcing on a day-to-day basis. The Intergraph project was an unmitigating disaster for this state. They could not get ambulances to cases in any reasonable time. In fact, there were situations where they said they did not have ambulances available when they clearly were available. There were many deaths due to delayed responses. During the Kennett era, I'm aware of at least 5 to 6 coroner's court cases where Victorians died due to delayed responses. Tragically, one of those cases was the past Mayor of Ringwood, Miss Patricia Gottlieb, who died from an asthma attack, and unfortunately an ambulance couldn't get to her on time. The Ambulance Union participated in these coroner's court cases to highlight the inadequate systems provided by Intergraph. Jeff Kennett and Jack Furman have Victorians' blood on their hands for the cost of ideology and money. We publicly would highlight what Kennett was doing with the ambulance service, poor response times, deaths, privatisation. Victorians were extremely worried about their services. This obviously led to the Bracks government commissioning a Royal Commission into ambulance services in 2000. A recommendation from that Royal Commission was that the emergency service communications should be publicly owned and operated. This led to the formation of Emergency Services Telecommunication Authority. With ambulances, Jeff Kennett went too far when he tried to privatise ambulance branches, where he was trying to set up little franchises across Melbourne. He was successful with one branch, and that was out at Cranbourne, where a group of paramedics negotiated a contractual arrangement to provide ambulance service to the Cranbourne suburb. These paramedics worked 24-hour shifts, and the service was propped up, of course, by Metropolitan Ambulance Service, with the provision of additional intensive care services and other ambulance resources going into Cranbourne. That contractual arrangement lasted in excess of 10 years. I'm now pleased to say Cranbourne Ambulance was brought back into public hands under a Labor government. Kennett tried to extend the branch franchising to Knox Ambulance, but the union defeated that attempt in the Fair Work Commission. The worst attack on Ambulance Victoria by Kennett and Furman was the attempt at cultural change. What they did was to target station officers and assistant station officers' positions by changing their position titles and job descriptions and making them all reapply for their positions. These were paramedics in their 40s and 50s with excess of 20 years service. The knowledge and experience these officers had was irreplaceable. They were all taken away to camps where neuro-linguistic techniques were performed. In the ambulance, we called these camps Camp Wacos. Most of these paramedics were brainwashed into taking redundancies. Only 3 to 4 of them stayed with the ambulance service after this. This meant that around 80 of the most experienced paramedics left the ambulance service. The mental damage that was done to these paramedics is immeasurable. Isn't it ironic that Jeff Kennett ends up being the head of Beyond Blue, an advocate for mental health? I wish he was an advocate for mental health during his time as Premier, rather than the enormous mental damage he did to public sector workers and other Victorians. One of the other rights Kennett removed from workers was the removal of common law rights if you were injured at work. This was devastating for workers that were seriously injured at work. I have an example of this from a paramedic that was injured during the Kennett period. Sorry.
Order. The member for Warrandyte on a point.
To page 62 of rulings from the Chair, where it is unparliamentary to make imputations against a former Premier. And I ask you to pull the member back into line, as a large part of his contribution, which we have let go for the best part of 12 minutes, is actually against parliamentary procedure.
Order. The ruling that's referred... on the point of order.
Speaker, just in relation to... There was no imputations against the Premier's character. It was in relation to whether at the time he actually had a greater focus on mental illness after...
The Minister will resume his seat. Order. The Minister will resume his seat. I've warned members to stop shouting across the chamber. When people are taking points of order, I expect them to be able to be heard in silence. The Minister to continue. I've warned members they'll be kicked out of the chamber without warning, for those members who weren't in the chamber earlier.
Thank you, Speaker. It was a passing comment in relation to the interests of the Premier prior and after he left, but prior to him leaving and then after him leaving in relation to mental illness. And he just said that he would prefer to have a particular focus prior to the Premier leaving than that he has particularly today. So I don't consider that an imputation.
The point of order, the Leader of the Opposition. Order. The member for Lara can leave the chamber for the period of 1 hour. Order. Leader of the Opposition on the point of order.
Speaker, the actual heading is imputations against former Premier, so the member for Warrandyte is entirely right. The prohibition on using offensive or unbecoming words in relation to members does not apply to former members. However, members who make allegations about former members must do so with care and be aware of the right of reply procedure. To suggest that someone who's devoted a lot of his post-politics life to addressing mental health issues is not fit for that purpose is a clear and disgraceful personal imputation against a former Premier. I understand the member for Melton is new. I understand the member for Melton is new to this place. But this is a matter that should be a bipartisan matter, and that was a completely inappropriate intervention by the member for Melton. And Speaker, I'd ask you to counsel him and bring him back to making his statement in accordance with the forms of this House, which he certainly was not.
Order. The grievance debate is a wide-ranging debate. I do uphold the previous ruling that's been referred to in rulings from the Chair. As the Leader of the Opposition has just pointed out, that requires members, when they're making comments about former members, to do so with care. So I ask the member to do so with care, and also to be aware of the right of reply procedures that members of the public do have. On a further point of order, the Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, the member for Melton is talking about injured ambulance workers under the Kennett years. Will he also explain how his government stuffed up the legislation to protect ambulance workers now?
Order. The member for Melton has the call.
How was the tennis?
Order. On a further point of order, the member for Warrandyte.
Speaker, on a number of occasions, the member for Ringwood and the member for Frankston have made interjections. Neither of them are in their places, and I ask you to direct them, if they're going to make interjections which are in themselves unparliamentary, that they do it from their correct seats.
I remind all members to any comments they make in the chamber should be from their places. Member for Melton.
Yeah, bring it on. Not much left.
Order. Member for Melton, resume your seat.